Our scripture reading today is Genesis 22, verses 1 through 14. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham?" "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went up together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood, and then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
My baptism. I remember it as if it were yesterday, 28 years and about 2 hours ago. An elder and I stood in the wings, just off to the left-hand side of the baptismal, from the congregation's point of view, while Reverend Jeff Bartlett spoke whatever it was he was saying. Who am I kidding? I was 9 years old at the time. Like I really remember much beyond the off-white, cream-ish colored paint that adorned the inside of the baptistry at First Christian Church in Centralia, Missouri. It had a mildly neutral and uninspired look to it under the gaze of the orange-yellow incandescent lights. Very calming in that respect, I suppose. I even have the vaguest memory of opening my eyes mid-baptism to see it dancing there, just as mildly neutral and uninspiring on the ceiling as well, even though the ripples had formed in the water, giving it a little life. But aside from that, the morning's all kind of a blur. Between being young, between being a little anxious, between any number of thoughts and emotions, and heck, I've slept since then. I honestly don't remember much of what happened that day. But I bet I bet I could take a pretty good stab at what was happening because I remember any number of other baptisms that took place in my home congregation. I could tell you that the pastor's seat on the chancel was vacant at the beginning of the service. And that would have been unusual, but not a problem. The worship leader handled everything at that point anyway. I could tell you that the otherwise unobtrusive and usually unnoticed divider that stood in front of the baptistry window had been removed, and that the pulpit was no longer centered on the chancel, but sat off to the congregation's left-hand side, since more people seemed inclined to sit on the right-hand side of the sanctuary. I could tell you that the curtains, also an uninspiring shade of some cream-ish color, could not really keep that incandescent light from sneaking around the edges, creating this almost surreal kind of glowing effect around the window. And I can remember that when the elder standing backstage opened the curtain, it almost always seemed to happen quickly. And maybe that was to minimize the disruption, because those were the loudest curtains I have ever heard. Even if you were not paying attention, you still knew when the baptism was starting, because those curtains made for a loud, noisy announcement of, "Hey, look up here." Now, I will go ahead and apologize to anyone from the old home church who might be catching this later on the taping, because I can't promise that these recollections are 100% accurate. But I can tell you that there was a familiarity to our baptismal rituals. The sights, the sounds, the minor but noticeable differences, they had a power to them that was simultaneously disruptive and comforting all at the same time. It was laden with meaning in spite of the fact that its occurrence was so rare relative to our weekly practice of being a people at worship. And yet, I doubt I'll ever forget those little things, those minor differences that morphed the ordinary into the extraordinary, but did so in a way that was ultimately comforting rather than concerning, that bolstered faith rather than breaking it. And I now know, looking back, that all of that was a setup, just like Abraham. Now, I'm not sure he understood it at first either. I mean, on the one hand, it seems pretty obvious to us, but imagine going through all that he did rather than reading about it after the fact. Last week, it's his wife getting upset and saying, "You've got to throw out the stepson and that mother of his." And after getting the okay from God, Abraham does it. But this week, it's God that Abraham has to please. And this time, it's the only son remaining in the household, and God is asking Abraham to offer him up as a sacrifice. Now, set aside for a moment the ways in which our Sunday school learning may have made this all seem acceptable and normal. And you might begin to think, "You have got to be kidding me, God." In fact, across the centuries, this very story has drawn out a staggering number of questions and interpretations and, well, everything ranging from how bloodthirsty is our God to what father would fail such an obvious test? God wants you to say no. And of course, there's still that more mainstream understanding of these happenings, like a vision we find Paul crafting as he goes about connecting Christianity to the covenant with Abraham. But Abraham, he didn't have the luxury of some clearly spelled out religious wisdom that has been written down for a few centuries now. He didn't have the opportunity to sit back and debate what was and wasn't going on. He didn't have the liberty of playing armchair quarterback after watching the slow motion replays for a few times. God was calling him to action right then and there, and he had to figure something out. So I think he then slipped into that comfortable routine of preparing himself to offer a sacrifice, something that he had done before and no doubt planned to do again. And using that comforting ritual, not something every day, a disruption that brought him peace, to put the nature of the sacrifice as far from his mind as he could, as he pondered on preparing for the act and ritual of sacrifice. The story tells us that he got up the next morning, harnessed the donkey, split the wood, probably all part of the normal routine for making a burnt offering. And then he gathered up Isaac and a couple of servants, and beyond that, well, nothing, at least according to the story. No conversation, no dilly-dallying. Maybe the preparation, the ritual of it all, maybe that's the only part that even matters at this point. What else could one do? What else could one say? Even up to the end, all our story records prior to that pivotal moment at the makeshift altar is that one rather terse conversation between Isaac and Abraham, wondering about the absence of the sacrificial lamb. And then we reach the high point in which this incredible finale finally takes place. God intervenes. Isaac is spared, and Abraham looks up to see a ram trapped by its own horns in the nearby brush. So Abraham takes the ram and offers it instead, and the sacrifice is made good. But I'm still drawn back to that sole recorded conversation between father and son. Where is the lamb for the entirely burnt offering? Because Abraham ultimately didn't offer a lamb at all. It was the ram that had the bad luck of being trapped in the bushes that ended up on the altar, not a lamb. Now it's subtle. It's subtle, but if you pause to consider it for a moment, that movement from lamb to ram kind of hints at a shift. Rather than a child being offered up on the altar in the form of the lamb, it's the father in the form of the ram that ends up in the sacrifice. And there's something telling in that. For as much as the birth of Isaac had surely come to stand for God fulfilling the covenantal promise, setting aside for now the firstborn Ishmael, who we discussed last week, we all know that Isaac was only just the beginning. The promise of the covenant wasn't fulfilled with the birth of Isaac. God was just getting warmed up. And yet, we can all imagine that Abraham certainly had to be tempted by what he had. Like a cosmic version of, let's make a deal. The choice before him was to take the child that he has, a source of great joy and a sure sign that God was with him, or swap that for whatever God had in store behind door number 2. Heck, it wasn't even a choice of the devil you know versus the one you don't. It was the blessing you know versus the one you don't. But ultimately, Abraham had to choose. Does he keep Isaac and risk selling short on unimaginable possibility of a covenant made with God? Or does he trade Isaac's life for the seemingly paradoxical promise of descendants as numerous as the stars after having sacrificed away both of his children? Maybe you can begin to see why I described this as a setup from the get-go. Because at the end of the story, I'm not so sure that this was actually a test of whether Abraham would be willing to give up his own child in the name of God's promise, but rather whether Abraham would be willing to give up himself in the name of God's promise. Surely it is no accident that a ram was offered up to the flames that day. I think all along, God was asking Abraham not to make the sacrifice, but to be the sacrifice. To be willing to receive a promise beyond measure while simultaneously being willing to let that promise go. That old cliche, let go and let God. If there was ever an example of letting go and letting God, this was it. Remember how last week I did the 2-minute drill version of Genesis chapters 12 through 20? All of that setup about God entering into a covenant with Abraham and his own subsequent human anxiety around a promise that it seemed would ultimately be impossible to fulfill? Well, after 9 chapters of build-up to the birth of Isaac, we have him born and then bound here in chapters 21 and 22, followed by Sarah's death in chapter 23, Isaac's marriage to Rebekah in chapter 24, and then Abraham's death at the beginning of chapter 25. It would seem that the fulfillment of the promise encompassed more sorrow than happiness, at least in the short term of what remains of Abraham's story. But we already know that in the long term, It's Abraham's willingness to give himself away that even sets in motion the chain of events that leads to us being here to talk about his seemingly impossible choice today. So at the risk of really overreaching this morning, this is where I'm going to make the turn back to baptism. And not just my own, but all of our baptisms. All of that relatively comforting ritual that I was describing at the beginning of the message. All of that talk about the differences in the worship service being comforting and not concerning, of bolstering faith rather than breaking it. It's a setup. Like Abraham's preparations for that long walk to the place of sacrifice, these comforting rituals might be a way for us to avoid or ignore thinking about the sacrifices God is going to ask us to make when we choose this path. But none of that changes the fact that God is going to ask for them. There's a reason that I compare my own journey to ministry to the story of Jonah, and not favorably, I might add. When it became apparent what God was wanting to do, I sure didn't want to do it. Well, not at first anyway. Obviously, it's grown on me a little bit. But I soon discovered, just like Abraham, that covenant really does cut both ways. It's not just about what I am going to get or receive from God. It's also about the sacrifices that God is going to ask me to make in return. And there will be days, like Isaac's wedding, when it is a glorious and joyful and it's celebratory. And there will be days like Sarah's passing, when it is morose and dark and painful and simply all too much. And it's not only true for us as the baptized, but it's also true for us as the church of the baptized as well. We are all heirs to the promise, both as individuals and collectively. And that means that we are all going to be called upon at some point to make that long walk and leave something at the altar, both as individuals and as church. The question before us will be the same one put before Abraham. Is it enough to embrace the promise that God has already faithfully demonstrated to and for us? Or is it incumbent on us to let go and let God, so that the covenant might continue to live on through us, to and for others, knowing that we will leave something of ourselves behind when we make that choice? Now I know that I've spent a lot of time talking in metaphors up to this point, and truth be told, it's because I don't really know yet what our choice is going to look like. I could tell you more about mine, that I gave up what might have been, at least, a more lucrative career in the computer world in order to embrace God's call to ministry. But that would be looking backward and looking at me, when the truth is that God is calling us to look forward and to look at us as a church. It is still my hope, and my plan for that matter, that we will embark upon a journey of discernment and discovery as a congregation that will reveal a new chapter in the history of First Christian Church that also happens to be yet another chapter in the unfolding of God's covenant. And as part of that journey, I'm going to work to open up conversations in such a way that it's not just my voice that is heard, but that we have opportunities to make all of our voices heard. During my absence next week, while I'm off attending the General Assembly in Indianapolis, I have asked Janet to fill our pulpit in order to do just that, to expand the conversation that flows from our worship life to include the voice of a dedicated lay leader from within our community. Additionally, on the Sunday immediately after General Assembly, Yuki has graciously agreed to relieve me of the duty of bringing the message so she can bring her own unique perspective to our pulpit, an opportunity to help leaven our conversations about God's covenant and call for us as a community. For this is our time as a church to be discussing and dreaming, preparing to celebrate our first 100 years while laying the foundation for our next 100 years. I honestly cannot think of a more exciting time in the life of the church than the one that lies before us right now, a time that is brimming with possibility and promise. However, I warn you, If Abraham's story teaches us anything, it's that God's covenant truly does cut both ways, a promise of both blessing and sacrifice. And I suspect that in this exciting moment of possibility and opportunity, that we may also face decisions that might be challenging at best and potentially heartrending at worst. But if the life of receiving blessing and in turn being blessing were easy, well, then God wouldn't have needed Abraham to do it. And God sure wouldn't need us now. So let us embrace the opportunities and the choices before us. Let us embrace our own walk into the wilderness to join God at the altar. Let us live fully as children of the promise and become faithful stewards who will prepare the way for all of the children of the promise yet to come. Amen?
Amen.
Amen.